So we are pleased to announce the publication of Police Street Powers and Criminal Justice. And today we're delighted that Sarah Charman from Portsmouth University, who's a reader in criminology and author of the excellent Becoming Blue, has agreed to talk to us a bit about the book and ask us a few questions. So thanks first to Sarah for taking the time for actually reading the book. We finally do have one reader who's not involved in the editorial process. And hopefully we'll cover in this session a number of the key themes of the book as we move on.
Just to start off, I want to say to Jeff and to Mike, I thoroughly enjoyed reading this book. It's undoubtedly going to have a lot more than one reader. It was a fascinating read, which I read pretty much in one sitting, cover to cover, and enjoyed every minute of it. Highly recommended to you all. I just wanted to ask some questions, first of all, about ethnography generally, and to talk a little bit about the research that you did. Amazed, 163 shifts, 1,500 fieldwork hours, and I think incredibly 38 stations. I just wondered if you could start off just telling me a little bit more about how you went about it.
It started 6 years ago, and it was we were just approached by a police force to help them understand how officers were using their powers. It was a slow start. We started observing some officers October 2013, and it took a good while to pick up some more volunteers and some to really start to get around the force. So it's just been time and patience, and then moving on to a second force from 2016 onwards. And that again is just a kind of patient and persistent bothering of police officers for their time and their endurance, really. Don't know if you'd add anything to that, Jeff.
Yes, we were originally approached to look at disproportionality in stop and search at our first force, and that was what our second force also wanted us to do. But we were quite clear that if we went in with that brief, that the data we'd get wouldn't be great. Officers would know what we were looking for and would change their behaviour. So we came up with the idea that we would look more widely at police discretion and use of all street powers, which would include stop and search, which was really what the police were interested in. And if you think back to 6 years, this was when Theresa May was Home Secretary, and she was concerned about disproportionality, particularly against young black men, of the use of stop and search. So the police forces at the top level were genuinely trying to get on top of this and saw me and Mike as part of their solution package. So we went in with, we got the freedom to go in with a broad remit as long as we turned up at the various stop and search committees and reported back on that particular topic.
I mean, that's really interesting in itself, because you mentioned the origins of the project, but the evolution of the project means that it's so much more than a study of stop and search. How did that evolve into being the much bigger project that it turned out to be?
Well, because from the start we were, as Jeff said, we were looking at discretion and particular use of powers but in the wider context of the job. So you can't understand stop and search if you don't understand the other options available to officers and so forth. And inevitably, once you wander into a police station, you don't just pay attention to a limited range of things. You're noting anything and everything. But I think also the fact that we come from very different academic backgrounds means that we then observe different things as well as individuals. So for me, it's much more about the public management background, social policy interest. For Jeff's background is much more in law and policing, public order policing, and football crowds. But so we both came with very different perspectives, so began to see different things, and from that then develops a conversation about what it is that we make of that world of policing. Really.
I love your description, Mike, of ethnographic work on the police as bothering the police. I think this is a new description of what ethnographic work is all about. You say in the book that it's not an ethnography of the police, but that it is ethnographic. What's the distinction there? I
think this is one of the areas where myself and Mike have slightly different views, and this may be something that bothers me more than it bothers Mike. I mean, an ethnography, as far as I'm concerned, it's a written account of culture. It is there to describe the field, the culture that is being observed. I mean, we used ethnographic methods in the fact that, you know, we were doing observations, we were doing ride-alongs with the police, we were involved in conversations more than we were involved in interviews, although we did do interviews, but we didn't do any survey, we didn't use any survey data. We was very much trying to get into the interpretation and the understanding of the officers. But this book is very much focused on the use of police powers, so it's very much just one element of the job. And I think an ethnography of the police forces in question would have been even more broad than the actual book is. I think for me, it's not an ethnography, although, you know, it's not to say we won't write an ethnography in the future, but it is instead an ethnographic study, which we would hope would have some policy implications, and identifies very clear and answers very clear legal and socio-legal questions.
You talk about, in terms of ethnography, you talk about the empathy that you felt towards the officers that you spent considerable amounts of time with. Is there a need in ethnographic research to try and control that empathy, or is it something that just is part of ethnographic research?
I think if you, I don't know if empathy is necessarily the right word. I'm not sure, but if you to write an ethnography, to really understand the world as the police see it, I think you really have to be able to understand that in a you know, not in some kind of abstract way, but in a very close and personal way, really. So that doesn't mean to say you're not able then to step out and be critical. I think you know, we could sit there and understand why officers were doing something without necessarily agreeing with what they were doing or thinking what they were doing was the right approach. Maintaining that ability to step back, if you like, is the trick, I guess. That's where, I mean, I think is it Bourdieu who talks about betrayal of our informants, because in a sense, you know, we then wander off back to our desks and type up whatever it is we think happened. You know, and in doing that, perhaps we have to be open to the possibility that we kind of we do let them down. We betray them in some sense. Not that
and part of that, I suppose, is about building trust with the people that you're spending time with. And there's some really brilliant bits in the book where you talk about the move from tolerance to acceptance, where you talk about the nod of acknowledgement that means that, you know, you can read the field, as I think you put it in the book. How much do you think that being like them, you know, that you're two male white authors, how much do you think that being like them added to your ability to build that trust?
I think it played. I mean, I think in terms of building trust, I think that was important. Most of our participants were white male. We did have women participants, and we did have officers from ethnic minorities, but they, particularly the ethnic minority officers, were very much in a minority in the police force. And I think it was useful in terms of building trust. But I think there's in ethnography, there's a lot of fetishization of being the insider. And I think it is incredibly valuable. And we felt it would be valuable in terms of trying to identify the disproportionality. But actually, if you look at some of the ethnographies of women, for example, something like Beth and Loftus's ethnography, they have a very much different focus in terms of discrimination and identified a lot more sexual discrimination in terms of the police force. So I don't think there is a right way to do this. I think being an insider and gaining trust and essentially pretending to be one of the officers you're observing is, of course, valuable. But I think if all ethnographies were carried out by people like me and Mike, I think we'd be missing something very important.
I think I would just add to that. I mean, I don't think I've ever pretended to be a police officer. I think it was always clear that we were not officers. Very, very clear. We went in uniform for a start. and we were deemed, looked upon with a degree of suspicion because we're academics, and they're not, they're, woolly liberal sociology types. That was a kind of, for some officers, that's definitely who we were. So it wasn't such an easy kind of fit, if you like, with us in the police force. I think we then had a third colleague who did some observations, Liz Turner, and she's very definitely female, very definitely young, sort of quite slight sociologist, criminologist, and she was received very differently by the police. She was always treated like she was on a school project. So, we did note how we were treated differently, and how our sort of demeanour affects how we are received in the field. And I think that's something for future writing potentially, but not so much in this book at this stage.
You cite the work of Bittner in the book, which is great, and the quote in there about the real reasons for invoking the law are wholly independent of the law that is being invoked, which I think is a fascinating quote on the usefulness of the law with regard to policing. And the research that I did, I found that law almost played only a bit part really in policing, and I found that from the research that I read in your book that you found pretty much the same thing. Can you talk a bit more about law playing that more minor role in policing than people might think?
Yeah, well, I think this is something that has been covered, going back to ethnographers like Bittner in the the 60s and 70s, and it's something we've seen both in America and also in Europe. I think police officers often feel that they are enforcing the law, but actually the first thing we found was that quite a lot of officers didn't actually understand the law that they were trying to enforce. And as someone that's I'm currently a senior lecturer in criminal law, I was quite surprised at the level or sometimes a lack of understanding of officers. It's been noted by a lot of scholars, Waddington, for example, that police officers aren't in a good position to apply the law because often they don't actually understand it, or they only understand an interpretation of it. But I wouldn't go as far as Bittner in terms of saying that it's more of a case of invocation. I think police officers felt that they were applying the law, but actually what they were doing was they were applying their interpretation of it, and their interpretation of it was in turn based on an interpretation of whoever had trained them to be officers, and training, various different training packages, and also how they were supervised by the sergeant and by their inspector and higher up. So actually, in terms of how officers applied the law, policy, force level policy, was more important, and that where it was effectively supervised, particularly at sergeant level, would lead to officers applying a particular version of the law. So they always felt that they were applying the law, and always considered that proper policing was law application rather than the softer social work side of policing. But actually the law, in inverted commas, that was being applied was sometimes very, very different from that which we see in the courts or on the statute book.
I think the relationship that you discussed then, Jeff, between the law as it stands and when it's actually implemented by officers on the street is fascinating, and it seems to be a recurring theme in the book. And I can fully understand why you would see that officers think that they are applying the law, because they are told that that's the law that they are applying. But by the time, as you rightly mentioned, it's gone down from the law to the College of Policing guidelines, down to policy, down to supervisors, down to trainers, and down to officers. It's gone through so many variations that they are interpreting the law in their own particular ways. So I think that's a really interesting part of the book, which I really enjoyed. And I was wondering, in relation to that, if we move on to talk about discretion that police officers are showing, and that you talk a lot about in the book, is there a difference between discretion and decision making in terms of policing?
I think a lot of legal scholars, particularly in traditional legal studies, have tended to look at police discretion as just in that small element in between a police officer arriving at the scene of a crime, for example, or confronting a suspect, and deciding whether or not to apply the criminal law and to apply procedures on arrest or stop and search, for example, or whether to turn a blind eye or you know, engage in an act of what Bittner would call peacekeeping. Our view was that you couldn't understand street powers just by looking at that sort of invocation discretion. And instead, we needed to look at wider forms of discretion. One of those was what we've tentatively called airwaves discretion. So when an officer who's in a response role gets a call that there's a domestic, you know, whether they're actually going to say, yes, I'm going to respond to that, or whether they're going to look for a juicier call to go out to. They're going to have their eye on where they are in the shift. They're going to have their eye on where their colleagues are and what other jobs they've got on. And those kind of decisions, and the other decisions that Mike would always come back to is whether to turn right or left out of the station at the start of a shift. Those kind of decisions were absolutely key in terms of how and against whom street powers would be used, and probably much more important than the decision making that is made when faced with the suspect.
I mean, I think for me, I'd sort of add to that as well, is that so much of actually what officers did, they did without considering what they were doing, that they didn't realise they were deciding to do something or not to do something else. So it was paying attention to the way the little acts, the little decisions affect the bigger picture, was kind of what we were talking to officers about very often. Right? I mean, the left or right decision depended on the time of day, which is really intriguing. You know, you come out once the station during the school run, and you don't turn left because you'll never make any progress because the school's that way. So you go right at, you know, between 3 and 5 o'clock. So that affects what you police and who you police. And it's just not reflected upon by the police, generally speaking, until you kind of start having a conversation with them in the car, saying why are we going left today or right today? Why aren't we going, you know, to such and such a place where we just in the briefing were told there was a crime wave going on, whatever. You know, so all of these sorts of things. But whether it's discretion or not is problematic. Everything becomes discretion then if you're not careful, and therefore discretion ceases to be useful as a word sometimes.
This links really closely to something that I'm researching and writing about at the moment, which is about the importance of time, the importance of people, and I'm going to say it, the importance of culture as well. And I've just, in fact, put the finishing touches to a paper where I've talked about issues around this, about the unfair distribution of police resources, and said that it's enabled by police discretion, it's justified by a focus on who deserves and who doesn't deserve, but it is encouraged by cultural practices and assumptions. So to me, there's three things working there at the same time. So discretion is absolutely part of it. Discretion enables somebody to go left or right, or to give certain people more time or certain people less time. It's justified by who they feel deserves what kind of service, but it's encouraged by culture. And I'm just throwing the culture word in to see what happens next.
Okay, but what does culture mean?
If we could start by just talking about it in terms of shared experiences, shared assumptions, would that be enough to say that there is a culture of sorts or cultures amongst the police?
Well, I mean, when the first 3 years of this research were fraught. So Mike and I didn't do our observations together. We did them separately, and I think we only did one shift where we were both doing observations at the same time, and even then it was different ends of the force area. And I say that some of our early observations were fraught. It was because when we would get together at the end of each month, we'd discuss what we'd found, and we were expecting to find culture because that's what ethnographers do. We were expecting to find these shared understandings. Instead, we actually found ourselves arguing, sometimes in a pub after we'd finished our normal teaching, finding ourselves arguing about what the understanding was, and even what the policy that the same police force or from the same police station was following. And it started to become clear to us that the only way we could understand what was going on was if we put aside this idea that there were shared understandings that would help us uncover what police officers did. Because actually police officers were understanding their role as officers, as well as what the policy was, what they should be doing, very, very differently. And it wasn't just that this was determined by what role they were in, or what gender they were, or what type of officer they were. It was, they would change their application of policy, for example, depending on where in their career they were. So you could have a neighbourhood officer who would apply their powers very differently to what they would do if they were in territorial support and involved in much more aggressive, for want of a better expression, proactive policing. So we looked for culture, we looked for these shared understandings, and obviously there were some shared understandings, because people will be asked to wear a similar uniform, they'll go through the same training processes, they'll discuss the same things in the canteen or in the office. But actually we found that difference between officers was far more marked than what was shared between them.
If we went looking for cultural explanation, I think we could have found some of the things that people would generally attribute to police culture. There's certainly an element of valuing the kind of the danger, the excitement, etc. There's definitely in some stations, not all, a culture of kind of fairly sexist banter, for want of a better expression. But that wasn't by any means uniform. That varied from station to station. And I'm just thinking of one, even in the same police station, different shifts behave differently. So in one police station, the shift would sit around the wall, the outside wall of the room, staring at a television on the other side of the room, and not speak to each other during tea breaks and ref breaks. Whereas in the same station, a different shift sat in the small kitchen area around a table that could seat comfortably 3-4 people, and there'd be 8 officers sat around that table, including with the sergeant and inspector, and very different team working environment, very different attitudes on display in that sense as well. So I think that paying attention to the difference was more important than looking for commonalities, if you like.
Sorry, Mike, and I think police studies has got itself in a little bit of a bind with culture, because it's sometimes been used uncritically without any discussion about where the idea of culture fits in and what it means. And of course, it was the classical colonial anthropologists that used to use this term to try and describe the other. And in police studies, we've moved away from this idea that there is one police culture which is macho, conservative, etc. And your own book, Sarah, is a very nuanced look at the different ways in which culture, for want of a better term, plays out and and develops in the police career and through police training. But it just led us in the end to actually think, how useful is this term to describe what is incredibly complex? And throughout our book, we've tried to demonstrate the different understandings of officers to the same type of scenario that they find themselves into, and when faced with the same type of person. And we just didn't think that we could find anything that was police culture that was identifiable, and we didn't think that police culture was useful to explain what we did find. So in the end, we felt we had no choice but to jettison it as a concept that we were going to use.
I agree that culture is an incredibly complex subject, and I also agree that I think it's been used in the past in a quite lazy fashion sometimes to explain away things that aren't easy to explain. But I think nonetheless, I would suggest that it's still an important aspect to consider, and you have absolutely done that in the book, and you've considered it in depth, which is really important. But then if you argue in the book that police officers are conservative, or if you say that, as you do in the book, that response officers are more likely to arrest and that neighbourhood officers are more likely to favour informal resolution, although that doesn't encapsulate everything about that officer, are these all not small cultural characteristics that add up to the whole of a policing culture or policing cultures?
But I think those examples are to me, illustrate the problem with culture as a concept, because it's entirely explicable by the rules and processes and et cetera, et cetera. We don't need some abstract idea called culture to explain why neighbourhood officers and response officers work in different ways, because the nature of the job is different, the way they're supervised is different, et cetera. So we can identify what it is that means that they behave differently, but without needing to refer to something called police culture.
Okay, let me go with something else then. How about cynicism? Do all police officers display a certain amount of cynicism, either in the course of their duty or in discussions with fellow officers? And would police officers recognise cynicism as being somehow connected to their occupation?
I think in their verbal exchanges there's a good deal of cynicism, undoubtedly. But does that affect what they do on the street? I'm not sure it does. If you were really cynical, you wouldn't be you couldn't be a police officer. You have to be able to put aside cynicism in order to deal with the same people for the same offences day after day. You know, if you're cynical, you couldn't do that job.
So then we're into one of the conclusions of the book, which I think is really interesting, where you talk about the difference between behaviours and attitudes, and that's an important distinction. It'd be useful if you could perhaps share a bit about that conclusion that you come to.
Well, I mean, so the individual attitudes of officers very often actually are something we're not very aware of. Those officers we observe, we often spend hours and we'll talk to them and learn a good deal about them. But not all officers on the shift. So the point I'm trying to make is it's not the individual psychology of the officers that necessarily determines behaviour. It is, as I said, the supervision or the procedures or the forms they know they're going to have to complete when they get back to the station that will shape how people respond to things. So behaviours are shaped by lots of things that we can identify and change. The attitudes may be harder to change, but they're not necessarily driving behaviour.
Yeah, it was something we couldn't, as Mike says, it was something that we couldn't observe. We could observe very quickly changing police behaviour. So we certainly didn't see any suggestion that there was a conservatism to the police and that they were resistant to change. We actually found that where they thought the change was beneficial, frontline officers would change what they did very, very quickly, particularly if they were supervised in that sense. So a lot of the book we're arguing that, police change is not just achievable, but it defines what the police do. But as Mike says, we couldn't observe those attitudes. But even if police officers have those attitudes, and we would speculate that they don't all share the same attitudes, even though obviously it takes a particularly confident person to apply to become a police officer. So you will get certain similarities in terms of approaches to social interactions, for example. But we weren't able to talk about attitude because it wasn't something that was observable. And we're very clear in the book, I think, that our conclusions we're very happy with, and we think they're very robust. But essentially, we were just observing two police forces in the north of England, and we can't be absolutely sure that what we saw would be seen if we did the same ethnography with the Metropolitan Police, for example.
I think where I find the culture framework quite useful is when we get into the categorization that we all do as part of our social identities, the sort of us versus them. If I could use a football analogy for a minute, if you've got two, for example, Manchester United fans, they can presumably engage in a fairly easy conversation with each other because of their shared interests and their shared experiences. They're not necessarily the same people, they don't have the same views, but there's a sort of shared understanding and shared experiences, not necessarily a shared purpose. But I think they'll have different views on tactics, they'll have different views on managers and all that kind of thing. But faced with Arsenal fans, they will be as one, because that's when you get into the us versus them scenario, where I think culture can maybe play a more important role. you talked in the book, not necessarily in terms of us versus them or categorization, but that distinctness between one group and another group. Did you find that played out in the observations that you made?
To a certain extent, it did. I mean, the football analogy is really interesting because, of course, I've written on football before, and my finding was that actually there were a lot more similarities between different groupings, and I used the term subculture too uncritically, I think, in my earlier work. There were more similarities between match-going fans that like to drink of Liverpool and Manchester United, for example, than there were similarities between match-going fans of Manchester United and armchair fans of Manchester United. So I think it was more complicated than that. Police officers that we observed used the term "the public" generically quite a lot. They would talk about the public doesn't understand this, or the public expects this. And they would also then divide the public up between decent people and the criminal type, or they use various different terms for those. So they certainly tended to divide up the members of the public into that respect. But what the police also did was the officers wouldn't talk about the police service as a whole as much as I was expecting. And actually they would constantly complain about other officers who didn't follow their way of interpreting the law or following policy. They would ask, why some officers would say, you need to follow policy, because if you don't, it's making a rod for your own back. I don't understand why other officers don't do it. While other officers would say, well, I'm not going to follow that policy because I think it's wrong. And, I think it's terrible that police officers follow this policy, even though it's wrong, just because Sergeant wants them to. So actually, we found a huge amount of disagreement between different officers, and they would talk about each other quite negatively in terms of the different approaches to the jobs and the different roles in the police force.
And I think if you wanted to look at the kind of this group identity kind of thing, then you'd see it within the force. So nobody had a good kind word to say about traffic officers. The CID, the jokes about CID were endless. And obviously everyone knows that firearms need to use a crayon, et cetera, et cetera. All these are the traditional in-group, out-group jokes within a big organisation. They didn't have very kind words to say about members of other police forces either, because so yes, there's groups cohere around a sense of who they are, but it doesn't mean to say there's some unifying thing about the police, particularly.
You make a really interesting distinction in the book between decent people and the criminal type, and I've written as well about this in terms of the deserving and the undeserving. It's been a really clear delineation. Can you talk a bit more about what you found in your research?
Well, I'll illustrate with the first shift I went on. The officer took me on a tour of the patch and was able to point to houses he'd dealt with, people he'd dealt with, etc. And he had a very detailed list, in a sense, of who and where were the problem areas and the problem people. And the rest, the good people, the law-abiding people, he didn't really know anything about, which is kind of intriguing from the off, except that they were taxpayers, etc. So he had a very clear idea of who his attention was directed towards and that varied from one station to another in terms of precise characteristics in the geographical location, etc. But there was a broad characteristic of basically working class, generally male, generally between the ages of say 14 and 40 would be the focus of attention, and that was certainly my early impressions, and it persisted.
It was, in terms of attitude, it was one of the few areas where I didn't see much difference between officers, that there was this idea between, as you say, Sarah, the deserving and the undeserving. But there was a difference in terms of how the police powers were used against the deserving and the undeserving. Some officers did use their powers as they were advised in the book by policy, regardless of whether people were deserving or undeserving, whereas other officers applied those powers very, very differently. So a victim of crime that was undeserving would not get justice. One incident I went to was a young man who'd been deliberately run over on his own street and had suffered not life-changing injuries, but he'd broken bones. And it just wasn't reported because he was considered to be undeserving, and it was a targeted hit. He wasn't dead. Whereas, you know, had that have been somebody that was considered deserving, there would have been a very, very different approach, and that would have been a crime that would have been investigated.
I think
and that relates to something in the book that you talk about as well, which is time, which I think is absolutely fascinating. And I've talked about this in a recent paper in terms of the amount of time that is given to people based on this decision about whether they are, you know, genuine or ingenuine in terms of the perceptions of the police. And it's very interesting that time can be withheld. And I think that you found similar things in your research.
Yeah, and time was a very precious commodity for the police. The shift was typically 10 hours, but actually there would only be 8 or 9 hours of that on the street. And if you made an arrest, then that was 2 to 3 hours out of your shift gone. And very much time was spent doing jobs that officers wanted to, and carving out quality time for them and their colleagues, maybe to have a meal break or a coffee. And so, yes, officers didn't want to spend time on people they felt were undeserving, because that was time that may need to be taken up by 2 hours sat in a holding cell with somebody that they'd arrested, for example. People that were undeserving were less likely to make complaints. They were less likely to phone up the inspector at the police station, and therefore there was also less risk in not paying them the attention that they may have otherwise deserved.
And if you're talking about legitimacy of the police, which is also a focus of the book, then legitimacy is not just around police outcomes, but it's around the processes as well. And what you found is that there is an absence of processes for a lot of people whose calls to the police and requests for assistance are got rid of.
Yeah, and we found a big difference here between processes pre-arrest and processes post-arrest. And there's quite a lot of work now. Layla Skins, Hannah Quirk, amongst others, have looked at post-arrest processes and come to the conclusion that actually the Police and Criminal Evidence Act has had a massive impact upon how prisoners are dealt with. Yeah, there is still shady dealings that go on, and the correct processes aren't always followed. But typically those are processes that do follow the PACE codes of practice in almost all cases, and they are effectively supervised because you've got custody sergeants there overseeing. Pre-arrests, those processes were much more different. Officers behaved and applied policy and processes and practices very, very differently. And one of the reasons for that was just because there wasn't that effective supervision of what they did. So there was a very big difference in terms of how these procedures were followed across different roles that the officers were involved in and between different individual officers. And obviously that has a huge impact upon legitimacy. If you're treated on one day in a particular way by an officer and on another day completely different, it clearly brings into question the legitimacy of the police.
So is supervision crucial in all of this?
Our argument was that supervision was absolutely crucial, and I think one of the areas where future research is required is the extent to which the role of the sergeant influences police constables, because we think it's from our research it's absolutely integral. And the other issue I think is the influence of technology, body-worn video, tracking devices on radios, different ways of recording crime. All these are ways of remotely supervising and remotely managing police officers. And we think we started to detect some restraints on discretion in particular areas, such as, for example, responses to domestic abuse cases and stop and search, where these are highly monitored outcomes and highly monitored processes. And it may be that as this sort of remote monitoring becomes more effective, we will see discretion by police restrained further.
But for me, that's one of the interesting things about the word discretion, is because it hides a multitude of interpretations. So for some officers, discretion meant turning a blind eye to absolutely everything and doing very little at all. I remember very distinctly going to one operation, anti-burglary operation. A series of officers were deployed to this team temporarily for the night. And I was with one officer who's described as not knowing how to use discretion because he was constantly arresting people, etc. So, there's this kind of world of discretion, etc. Yes, there's a lot of monitoring of certain activities and certain behavior, but so much is not recorded simply because there's nothing there. Nothing happens. Nothing. Nobody's there to see that somebody's doing nothing, if you like. So it's kind of this huge voids for much of the shift in terms of supervision and technology.
You included a table in the book which was fascinating, which looked at the stops and searches that you witnessed.
Yeah.
There seemed to be an incredibly poor success rate of those stops and searches, which seems to contradict official data. What's your reflection on why that might be?
I think the success rate is not far off. I think it's about 10-12%. It's some forces are much better than that now, but it's not far off what was normal around the time, say 2014, 2015, when the majority of the stop searches we saw were taking place. So much of the more recent stuff, there's very few of them more recently, and that's a reflection of the best use stop and search and so forth. You'd expect also, actually, with us observing, that they'd be more effective as well. So that's perhaps the puzzle. It's not that it's out of kilter with the norm, but that it wasn't out of kilter with the norm, in a sense, for me. I don't know, Jeff, that's your take on it.
Most of the stop and searches we saw weren't intelligence-led stop and searches. So most of them were proactive stop and searches. We spent a lot of time in territorial support, quite a lot of time in neighbourhood. And what we found was that stop and searches would usually flow from an encounter with a member of the public, which was either a stop and account, so that's police officers basically saying to you, can I have a word, what are you up to? Or a vehicle stop check, where the police just decided to pull over a vehicle and see what it was doing. The police have the power to pull over a vehicle, and they have a de facto power to ask questions, because members of the public generally don't want to walk away from a police officer without saying anything. It does happen occasionally, but generally members of the public will speak to an officer because they feel that they have to. And we felt that the use of those powers was really significant, and understanding those powers also helps us to understand when stop searches took place. So a lot of the stop searches that we saw, it would be a stop check of a vehicle. So it'd be late at night, they would see a sporty hatchback of the type that is apparently used by drug dealers, and they would pull it over. And if there were young men on board, they would usually find a way to stop search. And one of the things we saw a lot was smelling of cannabis. So we'd ask, why did you escalate that up to a stop search? Oh, well, there was a smell of cannabis. Well, we were there. Sometimes there was a smell of cannabis, but we know what cannabis smells like. And quite often we didn't detect that at all. An officer said to us, sometimes we'll use smell of cannabis as an excuse to do a search of people that we think are of the type to carry out crimes. So it was actually not when the stop and search that took place that for us was questionable, particularly when we look at disproportionality. It was that original decision to stop an individual in the street or to stop a motor vehicle. And of course, those two decisions really are very rarely, or there isn't much monitoring or supervision of when officers use those powers.
Even though the smell of cannabis, according to the College of Policing, is not sufficient to stop and search.
Well, of course, we saw that guidance being rolled out So we saw changes to how some officers would behave. So some officers stopped that practice, some officers continued it. But we saw stop and searches falling off the cliff. So we went out with officers, you know, with a 5-year gap between observations. And before the College of Police guidance, they would have stopped somebody. And after the College of Police guidance, they didn't. And when we spoke to them, they said, yeah, that's because we can't do a stop search for smell of cannabis now, which was one of the reasons we came to our conclusion about the significance of police change and the significance of policy.
You mentioned age and you mentioned gender there in terms of two of the defining characteristics around a decision to stop. Do you think that those are the primary decision-making tools around age and gender rather than around ethnic identity?
I think for both of us, what we were seeing generally was the policing of white working class neighbourhoods rather than the very mixed communities. Not entirely, but in the majority of cases. So I don't think we could comment with a great deal of confidence about ethnicity in that sense. But certainly age and gender was very important. The joke would be, you know, an officer who says, let's pull a vehicle over. If it's driven by a woman or, you know, it's got a family, then there was a joke that was a bad spot, if you like. So they were looking for, generally speaking, cars with more than one male on board. In particular, why 2 males are more suspicious of one, you know, who knows? So it was that very much that kind of demographic that I was looking for. There was
profiling of vehicles. There was profiling of clothing. So while we were primarily looking at white working class areas, and these weren't our decisions. We would have liked to have been able to find more on the racial disproportionality, because racial disproportionality in stop and search was occurring in both of the forces, not at the levels that it was in the net, but we knew it was going on. But unfortunately, we didn't get the opportunity, for whatever reason that was, to look at the racial disproportionality element. But from our findings, we think it's very easy to see how racial disproportionality would occur in other areas. Because if you're operating in areas where there are high levels of ethnic minorities and high levels of black people, and you're stopping certain types of car or people wearing certain types of clothing because you think they are associated with gang activity, very easy to see how if you're a young black man in those areas, you're going to be stop and accounted, your vehicle's going to be stop checked, and that will almost inevitably lead to a stop search.
I'd add to that. If you look at what officers saw at briefings at the start of the shift, all of the images, generally speaking, fit the description of the people they then went out to police. So it's not down to an individual officers exercising some kind of judgment, but this is everything about the police force is pointing their attention in these directions. They are deployed to particular areas. The briefing tells them who the kinds of people they're looking for. All of their experience tells them this is what they're about. So, that is that culture. Without wishing to go back to that debate, or is that actually no? This is deliberate and identifiable cause and effect.
In the conclusion of the book, you talk about whether reform in this area might involve recording stop and accounts. And I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about that, but also talk about the impact of stop and account on community and police relationships.
I think in terms of the second question on police community relationships, it depends very much on the experience of the person being stop and accounted. Generally being asked by a police officer, you know, these stop and accounts were genuinely friendly encounters. It was, "You're right, mate, what are you up to?" And there would be a normal conversation. I think the problem comes when it's the same person that's been stop and accounted again and again. And we heard individuals that would say, "Look, this is the 9th time this week you've said this to me. I'm sick of it." And it was quite clear that there were problems in terms of legitimacy there, not because of how the stop and account was carried out, but because it was being carried out with such regularity. And the same goes in terms of stop and search. In terms of our views about whether these should be recorded or not, we had quite a bit of a debate between us about the extent to which recording these would have an impact upon their use. We felt that probably stop an account, if this was being recorded, would actually cause as many problems for the people that were stopped as the current system would be, as the current system causes them. In terms of stop checks of vehicles, we didn't see any reason why these shouldn't be recorded and why there shouldn't be a record, for example, of ethnicity and age and gender of the people that are stopped, because some records are already kept. And we just felt that vehicle stop checks, it's so unregulated. An officer doesn't need a reason to stop check. And we do feel that these need to be regulated. And if they are, we think there will be an impact upon the levels of stop search and perhaps upon those levels of disproportionality. It will certainly reduce the number of young black men that are stopped, even if it doesn't affect the disproportionality element.
I think one comment I'd add would be that those encounters that to an officer are friendly actually are not necessarily that. I mean, Jeff, you mentioned somebody being stopped, kind of saying this is the 9th time, but an officer coming up to you and chatting friendly in a friendly manner to you about what, is your brother still inside, etc., etc. That's not a friendly banter. That's somebody saying, I know about you. That's intrusion. That is not. This isn't bon on me, is it? It's I know you, I know about you, and I got my eye on you. So, actually, I think there's something much more pernicious in a sense about these apparently to the police officers friendly and jovial encounters where the public are compliant. Actually, I mean, when you look at one of the stop and searches I saw, when the member of the public was compliant, yeah, but he walked towards the police with his hands in the air, and other people you've seen, I think, Jeff, as well, walking towards the police, turning their own pockets out in the street because they expect to be searched.
And
that's a problem.
And I saw a very interesting incident where a police officer basically pretended they had the power to stop an account and that somebody was legally enforced to stop. But interestingly, me and Mike talked about this, and I was much more pro recording than you were, Mike, in terms of stop an account.
Stop an account, yeah, I think that's problematic. I mean, if you have this polite sort of exchange of conversations, you then detain the person to take their name and address, because as you start recording stop and searches, and we've seen this on the intelligence records, that are held on people. If you're recording the stop an account, then you're just adding to somebody's long record in a police database. And at times, and I've seen officers do this, they take one glance at a long record and assume guilt, because why have you had so much contact with the police? No smoke without fire, etc., etc. So actually, over recording is potentially a problem as well, and that's why on traffic stops, maybe it's just the vehicle registration that needs recording. The number of times that vehicle stopped as a proxy for the people inside and the owner, etc. But certainly the recording of why stops are done, traffic stops are done, not just that an officer can stop any vehicle. No, there has to be a road traffic reason to stop a vehicle, or an intelligent.
And you observed in your book, didn't you, that the first question that's always asked is, are you known to the police?
Yeah.
We're getting on to which is my favourite part of the book now, and apart from all of it, because as I said at the outset, I thoroughly enjoyed reading this. It's just a fantastic story of modern policing. There was a bit towards the end where you were talking about police reform, and you said that change in policing requires that policy is interpreted accurately and consistently, that it's supervised effectively, and that it's achievable in terms of time and resources. And I think all of these things may well have been known before, but have never been synthesized in that way. And I think it's incredibly important that those three things are thought of together when change and reform are being considered. I wondered if you could talk a bit about my favourite part of the book.
Okay, well, I mean, I guess it's almost that sentence is an example of the bringing together of the two perspectives as well. In identifying this sort of what we've called vertical and horizontal fragmentation, where policy is interpreted in so many different ways. We were kind of debating and arguing about what it is. What is this thing called policy? What in the policies plural, because it's not just a law, it's the interpretation all the way down. Actually, I think that sentence, it may be bring it all together, but it's a fantasy as well at the same time, isn't it? Let's be honest. There's a classic piece of work by Hogwood and Gunn on perfect implementation, and they list basically they define perfect implementation, knowing as a benchmark against which to do to like measure the imperfection of all policy, because there never will be this perfect world. Would be my take on it. So yes, it may be a great sentence encapsulating a lot of ideas, but it's pie in the sky. Let's be honest.
I think as long as the police are used politically, we will never achieve this. It is pie in the sky, as Mike says. And you know, the reason that we talked about change being an absolutely key factor in policing was because when we started off, there was the reduction of stop and search and the scrapping of targets, and then right at the end of our research, we just suddenly saw it going up again, and officers were told to do more stop and searches because suddenly the policy had changed. And obviously when you're getting these rises and dips and targets are brought in and then scrapped, and you don't have a long-term vision for the police, you're never going to get that clear, consistent policy, and there's always going to be problems in terms of interpretation and supervision because it never has long enough to bed in. And we can contrast that with the Police and Criminal Evidence Act for post-arrest procedures. That's been embedded, that's been supported by successive governments of various different colours. And as a result of that, the post-arrest procedures, that is now fairly established, and we don't have the same level of miscarriages of justice, for example, that we used to have prior to the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. So I don't think it's impossible that we could get this change, but it really does need that long-term commitment of different governments to allow this kind of thing to bed in. So I'm slightly less pessimistic than Mike in terms of the future. But really, we need to move away from the idea that it's bad apples in a barrel, or that it's culture of frontline police officers. The police generally do what they're asked to do, and we need to have a very serious conversation about what we ask the police to do.
Because there's somewhere in the book where you talk about this, and you say that in the interpretation of the law, the problem lies not with the discretion of the police, but with the construction of the law itself.
Yes, that's true. I mean, we engage with some of the previous arguments. For example, McBarnett, we quote a lot about the fact that the law puts in discretionary freedom for officers to apply that law in different ways to different people. So there are always ways in which laws can be changed. And for example, we made some recommendations about Section 24 of the Police and Criminal Evidence Act relating to arrest necessity. We feel that is far too vague. It doesn't place enough emphasis on necessity. It focuses too much on arrest reasons. And most police just don't understand how Section 24 is meant to work, and as a result, it's not applied correctly. And we've actually only started to see a reduction in arrests because it's become practically more difficult for police officers, rather than that the law has changed to make it more difficult. So the law does have a role to play, but effectively the law will only impact what police officers do if it is mediated through effective policy and effective supervision. The law on its own isn't going to change anything.
I mean, I think you can look at the policing challenge of the pandemic as a classic example of how not to do public policy and policing policy. Something rushed, ill-conceived, muddled, no kind of training and associated with it, interpreted differently by each police force, and down the line by officers. It's a perfect example of how not to do policing and public policy, really. We have been reviewing Police Street Powers and Criminal Justice by myself and Dr. Jeff Pearson, published by Hart this week, and would like to thank Sarah Sharman for reading it and for agreeing to interview us about the book. Thank you.